They called him a dictator. They showed his face on screens, painted in fear and fury. But behind the noise, behind the headlines written by powers far from Africa's deserts, lies another story, one that was buried, one they didn't want the world to see. This is not a story of perfection. It's a story of power, of vision, and of a man who tried to change the destiny of his people and his continent, and paid the ultimate price. He was born in the dust of Sirte, Libya, in 1942, Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi. The world he entered was one of poverty and humiliation. Libya, under the rule of King Idris, was a kingdom rich in oil but poor in pride. The British and Americans had military bases across the desert, and the people, especially the Bedouins, Gaddafi's own, lived with little to call their own. From a young age, he devoured the stories of Arab heroes, of anti-colonial fighters like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. He believed Africa and the Arab world could rise only when they owned their destiny. In 1969, at just 27, he led a group of young officers in a bloodless coup that overthrew the monarchy. The king fled. The young colonel stood before his people and declared, "This revolution is for the poor, for dignity, and for freedom." The world didn't pay attention at first, but what followed shocked them. He gave Libya back to its people. When Gaddafi took power, Libya was one of the poorest nations in Africa despite its vast oil reserves. The wealth was controlled by foreign companies and the royal elite. Gaddafi nationalized the oil industry. He forced multinational corporations to renegotiate contracts so that the profits went to Libya's treasury, not to foreign shareholders. Within years, Libya's GDP skyrocketed. The revenues built roads across the desert, new cities and ports. He said, "Oil belongs to all Libyans, not to one man." And for the first time, ordinary Libyans felt the benefit of their country's resources. By the 1980s, Libya had one of the highest standards of living in Africa: free healthcare, free education, and subsidized housing. He made education and healthcare free for all. Before 1969, education in Libya was a privilege of the few. Most people couldn't read or write. Gaddafi changed that. He launched a national literacy campaign that turned desert tents into classrooms. Teachers were paid by the government to reach even the most remote communities. Within 2 decades, literacy rates soared from 25% to over 80%. Healthcare became a right, not a luxury. Hospitals were built across the country, and doctors were sent abroad for training. He often said, "A nation that is sick cannot build its future." In his Libya, medical treatment was free. If a Libyan couldn't find treatment at home, the government paid for them to travel abroad. He made shelter a human right. Gaddafi once declared, "No one must live without a home in Libya." He believed that housing was not a privilege, it was a birthright.
In Libya has either
So
a home
he introduced policies
or
that
an
banned
apartment.
rent
They call it a
competition.
flat.
The government provided interest-free loans for home construction, and many families received land to build their own houses. He even refused to live in a palace. When foreign leaders visited, he would often host them in a Bedouin tent to show that leadership wasn't about luxury, it was about service. To this day, many Libyans remember that no citizen was left on the streets. He built the great man-made river. In the heart of the desert, where water was scarce and life struggled to exist, Gaddafi launched one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history, the Great Man-Made River. Stretching over 2,800 kilometers, it carried ancient fossil water from deep beneath the Sahara to the coastal cities of Tripoli, Benghazi, and Sirte. He called it the eighth wonder of the world. The project cost over $25 billion, fully funded by Libya's oil income, not loans from the IMF or World Bank. It provided clean water to millions of Libyans, transformed farmland, and showed that Africa could build greatness without begging for aid.
He fought for African unity and independence. To Gaddafi, Libya's revolution wasn't just for Libya, it was for all of Africa. He believed Africa could never be free until it was united. He pushed for the creation of the African Union, replacing the old Organization of African Unity in 2001. He dreamed of a United States of Africa, one army, one currency, one passport. He poured billions into African development projects, funded satellite systems to free Africa from Western telecom dependence, and offered financial aid to struggling African nations. This is Voices of the Forgotten, where Africa's buried truths rise again. Let's continue. Many African leaders admired him. They saw him as a man willing to spend his nation's wealth on the liberation of the continent. He was also one of the first leaders to propose an African gold-backed currency, the gold dinar.
It threatened the dominance of the US dollar and the French franc in African trade. And that, many say, sealed his fate. He uplifted women in a conservative society. In a region where women's roles were often restricted, Gaddafi took bold steps. He allowed women to serve in the military and even formed an all-female bodyguard unit known as the Amazonian Guard. He gave women the right to education, to own property, and to work in professions that were previously closed to them. In his Green Book, he wrote that a society that oppresses its women cannot be truly free. Female literacy in Libya rose dramatically. In universities, women began to study medicine, law, and engineering. It was a social revolution rarely seen in the Arab world at that time. He protected Africa's voice on the global stage. When Gaddafi spoke at the United Nations, he tore up a copy of the UN Charter, calling it a symbol of broken promises. He accused powerful nations of hypocrisy, preaching democracy while destabilizing others. He openly challenged Western control over Africa's resources. He helped fund liberation movements from South Africa to Namibia, standing against colonialism in all its forms. For many Africans, he was a symbol of defiance, a leader who dared to say what others feared to whisper. But to the world powers, he became dangerous, a man who couldn't be controlled. And so, the silence began. They called him mad, a tyrant, a threat. Sanctions were imposed. In 1986, American warplanes bombed Tripoli and Benghazi, killing his adopted daughter. But he survived, and his resolve hardened. Then came the 2000s. Gaddafi tried to rebuild relationships with the West, abandoning nuclear ambitions, opening Libya to trade. But when protests spread across the Arab world in 2011, everything changed. The West turned its gaze back to Libya. NATO warplanes filled the sky again. In the name of protecting civilians, they launched a campaign that shattered a nation. Gaddafi fled his capital, but refused to leave Libya. He said to those close to him, "I was born here, and I will die here." In October 2011, in his hometown of Sirte, he was captured and killed. The man who once dreamed of a united Africa died in the same desert where he was born. After his fall, Libya descended into chaos. The hospitals he built were abandoned. The free education system collapsed. The water from the great man-made river still flows, but with no leader to protect it, it risks running dry. And yet, across Africa, whispers of his vision remain. His gold dinar idea inspired debates about a new financial independence for Africa. His push for unity laid the groundwork for today's African Union. And his call for dignity, Africans must never be slaves to anyone, again, still echoes across generations. He was far from perfect. His rule was harsh, dissent was often crushed. But behind the political storms was a man who believed Africa deserved more. They silenced him, yes, but his dream, the dream of an Africa that owns its wealth, educates its children, and stands tall among nations, still breathes. Maybe one day, when the dust of history settles, they will see not just the man the world condemned, but the legacy he tried to build. Because in the end, what he wanted wasn't worship, it was freedom. Freedom from foreign chains, freedom from ignorance, freedom from the idea that Africa must always kneel. So when you hear the name Gaddafi, remember the story they never told you. Remember the 7 good deeds buried under the sand, the homes he built, the water he gave, the pride he restored, the dream he dared to imagine. They silenced him, yes, but they could not silence the idea that Africa's destiny belongs to Africans. And perhaps that is why they feared him the most. This is Voices of the Forgotten, where Africa's hidden truths rise again.